The silence between the shells, a soldier's memory of the Great War. The first sound I never forgot. I never expected silence to be the loudest thing I'd carry back from the war. Not the sound of the guns, not the whistling shells, not the screams, although they still visit me, but the silence, the thick, unrelenting silence that stretched between every moment of noise, like the war was catching its breath, and we were forced to listen. I was 19 when I left home. The air still smelled like harvest where I lived, dry, wheat, earth, and horses. I remember my mother standing in the doorway, holding a loaf of bread she'd made for the journey. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, as if to say, "I'll carry the grief. You carry your name." The train was crowded with boys pretending to be men. We all wore new boots and carried empty notebooks. Some were joking too loudly. Some stared out the window as if they'd never see trees again. I was one of the quiet ones. Kay had sewn my father's medal into the lining of my coat, even though he had told me never to bring it. "That one's not for glory," he said. That one's for remembering." I didn't understand what he meant, but I took it anyway. The first time I heard the front, it was in the distance. Low thunder, constant, almost unnatural. Like the earth itself was growling. When we arrived at the staging camp, we were greeted not by commanders, but by the smell. Wet wool, burning oil, and something else, metallic, sharp, and bitter. A smell that would tattoo itself to every thread of our uniforms. You learn quickly that war has its own perfume. They handed us our rifles, but not our reasons. It's that we were supposed to bring ourselves. It was 2 days before they took us to the line, and that's when I heard it. The sound that never left me. It wasn't the first explosion. It was the absence that came after it. The shell had landed far off, but the ground still trembled like it remembered worse, crouched by instinct, not by training. Someone laughed, nervously, too loud, and then nothing. No follow-up. Humber. Orders. Just the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting. Do you know that kind of silence? The one that creeps inside your ribs and hides behind your heart. It's not empty, it's full. It's full of all the things that might happen next. Looked around and saw the others frozen two eyes, scanning the horizon. That was the moment I understood. The shell wasn't the real threat. It was the pause between them. The part where your mind has too much room. Our trench was a half-flooded line of mud and woven sandbags sunk into a field that had once grown cabbage. Now it grew fear. Fear and rats. I shared a section with a man named Wilkins. He had a silver tooth and a wife who sent him pressed violets in her letters. He let me keep one once. I dried it inside my book of poems, which I stopped reading after a while. Not because I didn't love poetry, but because the words started sounding too clean. War muddies everything. The nights were the worst. Not because of the cold, although it did bite like betrayal. Not even because of the shelling, which came in random waves, like storms from a drunk god, but because of the silence between it all. There's a silence at night on the front that isn't just the absence of gunfire. It's the collective holding of breath. The way thousands of men across a line of trenches all lie awake at the same time, pretending they aren't afraid to sleep. Some prayed, some whispered to the dead, some counted seconds between distant blasts. I used to talk to the stars, because I believed they answered, but because they stayed. One night, I woke to a different kind of silence. It wasn't the usual lull. It was too complete. Even the wind had stopped. Even the rats had gone quiet. I crawled up to the edge and peeked over the trench wall. What I saw was fog, thick, low, unnatural. But in it, a single figure stood, still as a tree. At first, I thought it was a German soldier, a T. Then, I thought it might be one of ours, lost. Then, I realized I wasn't sure it was human. The figure didn't move, didn't raise a weapon, didn't call out. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was fear made visible. Maybe it was a ghost. But that was the moment I started to believe that the war wasn't just being fought on land, it was being fought inside us. 2. Wilkins once asked me, if you could bring only one thing home from all this, what would it be? I didn't know how to answer then. Back then, I would have said my body or my name or the book of poems. But now I think I bring the silence. Not the kind that haunted us, but the kind that healed us. The moment, just after the end of shelling, when you realized you were still breathing. That moment when the stars returned, when you could hear your own heart again. They say the war ended in 1918, but it didn't end in us. Not all at once. Some of us carried it home in our bones. Some carried it in our dreams. Some in our pockets, folded like old letters. And some of us, like me, carried it in the silence between our sentences. If you ever meet someone who speaks slowly, who pauses before answering, stares at the horizon even when there's nothing there, maybe they're not lost. Maybe they're just listening for something that once happened between the shells, the letters we buried so we could sleep. Some things we said out loud. Most things we buried not in the earth, but in ourselves, somewhere deeper than even the deepest trench. Not because we didn't feel them, but because to speak them would have made them too real. We wrote letters. That was our one thread back to the world. I wrote to my mother every 3 days, not because I had much to say, but because I knew she was counting the silences. Sometimes I just described the sky, or the bread, or a bird that landed on a wire. Never the fear, never the frostbite, never how Wilkins had stopped speaking altogether for a week. We didn't tell them those parts, because what could they do with that kind of truth? There was a man in our regiment named Theodore, French, older than most of us. He had 2 sons. He didn't talk much, but he always wrote. He folded his letters in perfect thirds, a peach, one with string from a ration sack. He told me once, I don't write to tell them I'm alive, okay? Write so they remember who I was. There was poetry in that, okay? Even if he didn't call it that. One night, under a rare moment of calm, I watched him digging behind the trench. Not a foxhole, not a latrine. A small hole, careful, precise, like a gardener. When I asked what he was doing, he looked at me with a kind of tired peace and said, I'm planting my words. If I don't come back, maybe the soil will carry them home. He buried the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in a biscuit tin, pressed deep beneath the mud of a war that swallowed too much. I helped him do it again the next week, and the next. Soon, more men joined in, not because they believed the letters would survive, but because they couldn't bear to keep carrying them. They said it helped them sleep, to know the weight had left their pockets, sit somewhere under their boots. Their truth still breathed. We made a quiet ritual of it, always at night, always behind the line, where the fog covered our hands. We called it the burial post. Not official, not documented, but sacred. Some carved initials into nearby planks. Some left flowers. I left pieces of pencil stubs, because even silence needs to be written. There were things I never wrote. Things I COULD in single quotes, like the night the trench flooded and the boy beside me drowned before I realized he wasn't sleeping. Like the time I watched 2 birds fight over crumbs on a corpse's helmet. At the moment I found a photograph of a baby in a coat pocket. Couldn't throw it away. Those became the letters I never sent, but still carried. I sometimes wonder, if you write something in your mind every night, does it eventually make its way into the soil of your soul? After Wilkins died, I didn't speak for 4 days. He was quiet when it happened. There was no scream, just a shift in the air beside me, then stillness. I remember folding his last letter, the one he never finished. It had only 2 words. Tell her I buried it with the others. I didn't know who her was, but I hoped the dirt did. They say words are powerful, okay? But I think it's silence that changes us. There's a silence that comes after someone dies, a pause where the air still expects them to speak. It lingers, it waits, and if you let it, it will shape you into someone who listens differently. That's what the war did to me. It didn't just fill my ears with noise, it redefined what quiet means. Years later, I returned to France, not for ceremony, not for closure, just to walk the fields and find the place where my letters still slept. The trees had grown back, the scars on the earth had softened, but I still felt the bones beneath the grass. And somewhere, I swear, I heard the sound of rustling paper, like the ground was still reading us. There was a boy there, maybe 17, a student, drawing in a notebook. He looked up and asked, "Were you one of them?" I nodded. He smiled, not out of reverence, but connection. And then he asked something I wasn't ready for. If you could write one more letter, who would it be for? I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because the truth was I'd been writing it this whole time to you. To the silence, to the part of me I left in that trench. If you're still listening, wherever you are, know this: some of us came home, but all of us left something behind. Some buried fear, some buried guilt, some buried love, but all of us buried letters, and not all of them needed to be read. Some just needed to be written so we could sleep. The boots we wore, the ones we lost. There's something strange about boots, how they outlast everything. They wear down, yes, but slowly, steadily, with dignity. Unlike us, we came back with torn skin and thinner hearts, but the boots, they just kept walking, even empty dot in the war. Your boots told your story before you even opened your mouth. A shine meant a new recruit. Mud-caked meant time in the line. A limp in the left heel, probably from the blast last month. The boot held together by string and stubbornness. That man's seen too much. You could read a man's boots like a book, and we did, because it was easier than looking in his eyes. Wilkins wore boots, 2 sizes too big, said they were his father's. He stuffed them with newspaper until today he didn't have to anymore. After he died, I carried his boots back to the trench. Didn't have the courage to keep them. Didn't have the heart to burn them, so I left them near the burial post, facing east. Don't ask me why. Maybe because I wanted them to keep walking. The door's boots were heavy, black, well-oiled. He used to polish them every Sunday, said. It reminded him of chapel, even without a priest, when he disappeared during the fog advance. All they found was one boot, empty, lying in the reeds like a message nobody knew how to read. I held it for a while. It felt like holding his hand. Then I buried it near the others. One boot, one memory, one prayer. I kept my own boots when the war ended, not because they were useful. They weren't. The soles had thinned until I could feel every stone beneath me. One toe had worn through, showing a hint of wool, but they were mine. They had walked through a world that no longer existed, and somehow, so had I. WWI. I got home. I put them by the door. People asked me why I didn't throw them out, why I didn't buy new ones, why I never wore them again. The truth, 'cause they weren't for walking anymore. They were for remembering. They were the only part of me that still knew how to carry silence without complaint. Years passed. Then one day, a young man knocked on my door. He was collecting items for a museum, said he wanted personal artifacts from the Great War. Asked if I had anything. I thought of the medals, the letters, the uniform, but my eyes went to the boots. He saw them, too. Ken asked, "May I take those?" I looked at him a long time, then said, "No, but you can sit with them if you're quiet." He did. He sat for almost an hour, not touching them, just listening. When he stood to leave, he whispered, "They feel alive. I nodded. They were. I've thought often about the men whose boots were never found, the ones swallowed by mud, by craters, by time. What stories did they carry? What goodbyes were etched into their souls? Do their ghosts still walk the fields? Did they find new feet to carry their silence? Sometimes I dream of boots walking on their own, rows of them, empty but purposeful, crossing the countryside, returning home, each step a memory, each footprint a name, and somewhere in that march mine are there too, old, cracked, but still moving, still listening to the ground beneath them, still whispering stories only the earth remembers. If you ever see an old pair of boots by a door, don't assume they're abandoned. They may be standing guard. They may be holding space. They may be waiting for someone to ask, "Where have you been?" Because some boots have walked through things that cannot be spoken, only carried. The day the sky fell, and we stood still. They told us it would start at dawn, but it didn't. It started before that, in the space between darkness and gray, when the world still hasn't made up its mind whether to hope or to hide. That was the day the sky fell, not with a scream, but with a low, growing hum, like the world was about to say something too big for words. We had heard bombardments before. We had braced for them, counted them, cursed them. But this one was different. It wasn't a shelling, it was a swallowing. The air shook in waves, not just from above, but from every direction, as if the ground itself had turned to thunder. Wilkins wasn't there anymore. Theodore had vanished weeks earlier. I stood next to a boy named Hal. He was 17. His helmet tilted too far back. He smelled like ink and lemons. He handed me a picture of his sister the day before and asked, "Do you think people remember more when they have something small to lose?" I told him yes. Even if I didn't know when the first shell hit, Hal was mid-sentence. He didn't finish it. The sound took the words, and then it took the sky. There's a moment in every soldier's life when the world slows, and you realize you're not running because you're brave, but because stillness would kill you. That moment came to me not as terror, but as clarity. The dirt exploded 20 feet from me, but what I remember is the feather that floated down beside it. One single white feather drifting through the chaos, as if the sky wanted to apologize. We didn't scream, we didn't cry, just moved like ghosts in borrowed bodies. Some fell, some froze, some crawled without knowing where they were going. I ran toward the crater. Don't ask me why. Maybe because I thought I'd already lost enough. Maybe because silence is louder at the edges, inside the crater. I found a man cradling someone's helmet like it was a child. He didn't look up. He just said, over and over, "Tell her I held on. Tell her I held on." I didn't ask who her was. I didn't need to. Every man out there was holding on to someone, even if they were already gone. And then silence, not the kind that comes after a prayer. It's the kind that comes after the world forgets how to speak. The shells stopped. Air didn't dot. It was still trembling. But we weren't. We stood still, not in defiance, not in strength, but in surrender. Surrender to the fact that we were still alive, and we expected not to be. Somewhere behind us, a bird sang. Clear, simple, one note. Thing too. It felt wrong. It felt sacred. Hal looked at me and smiled. His lips were bleeding. He said, "I guess the sky forgave us." Then he sat down, and we waited for the next shell. It never came. We walked back in silence. No one asked questions. No one counted the missing dot. There are days in war when math loses its meaning. Survival becomes the only language left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of how quiet it was. I stared at my hands, covered in someone else's dirt, shaking from someone else's grief. And I thought, maybe this is how the world resets. Not with a peace treaty, but but with a single breath after holding it too long. The next morning, I found Hal's photo tucked inside my boot. He must have placed it there. On the back, he'd written, "If I don't make it, tell her I looked up." That was all. Not I fought. Not I was brave. Not I died for something. It's just, I looked up. Maybe that's all any of us could do. They called that day a victory because we held the line, because the enemy retreated. But in my heart, that day wasn't about who won. It was about who still stood, who still breathed, who still had a reason to look up. If you ever hear a sudden silence after chaos, don't fill it too fast. Let it settle. It might be carrying a truth too fragile for words, or it might be waiting for you to remember what it feels like to still be here, what the fire forgot to burn. People often ask what the war destroyed, and I tell them, everything. It destroyed bodies. It destroyed songs, destroyed names we never got to know. It destroyed the part of the world that once believed in certainty. But that's not the full story, because the fire didn't take everything. Some things it forgot to burn. There was a violinist in the 2nd Regiment, a small man with trembling hands, too old to fight, too stubborn to stay home. They called him Echo. He didn't talk much, but when he played, the rats stopped. The cold stepped back. Came the war for just a few minutes. Forgot it was invited. He played from memory, songs from cafes, songs from lullabies, songs he swore he heard in dreams. One night, a shell landed near the trench. He survived, but the violin didn't. I found him kneeling in the mud, cradling the broken wood like a fallen comrade. And then, softly, he hummed the melody instead, and we all wept. I saw men share the last bite of food, give away dry socks like gold, cover someone else's eyes during bombardment, as if protecting a moment of peace was worth dying for. And maybe it was. There was a German boy we found wandering near the no man's land. He was 15, carrying a torn teddy bear in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was crying. He didn't speak our language. We didn't speak his. But one of our men, a father from Leeds, simply sat beside him, took the bear gently, and tied a clean cloth around its neck like a scarf. The boy handed over the pistol without a word. We let him go. No, one reported it. Not everything needed permission to be human. One morning, I saw a single red flower growing beside a body, bright, defiant. Its stem had pushed through mud, through blood, through barbed wire. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took off my helmet, and sat beside it like I was at church. Maybe I was there. Was a chaplain who used to say, "The fire burns what it understands. But the soul is made of other things." I think he was right, because the fire forgot to burn, the way Wilkins used to tuck his letters with a kiss, the way Hal kept his sister's photo dry with wax paper, the way Echo's music stayed even after the strings snapped, the way I wrote my mother's name on the inside of my collar in charcoal. Just in case they needed to send the coat home without me, the fire took so much. But not that. Years after the war, I visited a memorial, not one of the grand ones, just a field with stones, and names carved by hands that had known grief too intimately. While I stood there, heard a child humming, a melody I hadn't heard in years, the same one Echo used to play. I turned to see a girl, maybe 8, spinning in a circle, the tune on her lips like wind. I don't know how she knew it, but I smiled, because some things pass through time without asking sometimes. People ask me what I remember most about the war. They expect me to say the guns, the loss, the death. And yes, I remember those, but I also remember the smell of coffee made with muddy water, the way someone wrote poems on the back of ration cards, the hands that held mine in the dark without saying a word, the warmth of a coat shared in silence. Those were the things the fire forgot to burn, because fire can't reach what lives in memory, or kindness, or music. if you're listening to this, if your eyes are still open, I hope you know the world is still fragile, still flammable, but not beyond saving, as long as there's one person willing to protect a flower. One person willing to hum a broken melody. One person willing to carry another's weight for one more step. The fire loses, so tonight, if you find yourself afraid, the silence grows heavy. If the darkness tries to tell you stories made of fear, remember what the fire forgot to burn. It might just be what keeps you whole. The uniform never fit the same. They gave us new uniforms when it was over, pressed, clean, without stains, without tears, without memories. I put mine on, and it didn't fit. Not in size. In story, it felt like putting someone else's skin over a wound that never asked to be covered. They lined us up for photographs. Stand proud, they said. Smile, face forward. But all I wanted to do was look back at the boots we left behind, at the silence that shaped us, at the letters still buried in the mud. The camera clicked. The flash was too bright, and for a second, I forgot where I was. When the train pulled into the station near my hometown, I saw my mother waiting, same doorway, eyes, same hands folded across her chest, but something in her face said she was trying to decide, is this my son, or just what came back wearing his name? The children looked at us like we were giants. The older ones looked at us like we were ghosts, and we didn't know who to be. There's no manual for returning, no uniform for grief that wears a smile, no medal for surviving yourself. I tried to walk like I used to, talk like I used to, laugh, but the laughter sounded hollow in my chest, like it was echoing off walls I hadn't built. At dinner, my uncle asked, "So, did you kill anyone?" My fork paused midair. I looked at him, then at my mother, then at the window, and I said, "Not everything that dies bleeds." Didn't ask again. I hung the uniform in my closet. It stayed there for years, not because I was proud, not because I forgot, but because I didn't know where else it belonged. It didn't belong in a drawer, didn't belong in a fire, didn't belong on my body anymore. Sometimes I think it didn't even belong on me in the first place. One day, I saw a boy wearing his father's uniform at a parade, grinning, marching, waving a flag, and I wanted to stop him, not to shame him, but to ask gently, "Do you know what that fabric remembers? Do you know what it still hears in the seams?" But I didn't. He was too young to carry silence, and I was too old to interrupt joy. The worst part about coming home isn't what people say, it's what they don't. It's the way they avoid asking what you dream about. It's the way they assume a warm meal fixes cold memories. The way they celebrate your return without noticing that part of you stayed buried. With the boots and the letters and the songs no one sings anymore. One night, I tried the uniform on again. Years after, it still didn't fit. Not because I had changed physically, because the man who wore it never made it all the way back. He stayed somewhere between two trench walls, looking up at the sky that forgot how to choose a side. They offered me medals. I took them out of politeness, but I never displayed them. Not because I wasn't honored, but because the real honor wasn't mine. It belonged to the ones who never came home, the ones whose uniforms were never removed, the ones who didn't have to figure out how to smile at the wrong memories and stay silent through the wrong questions. If you've never worn a uniform, don't assume it defines the person. It's a symbol. But symbols are heavier than they look. Sometimes we wear them proudly. Sometimes we wear them because we must. And sometimes we fold them away because they no longer speak the language we need. So if you see an old coat hanging in a hallway, don't ask why it's still there. Just know it's maybe the only place left where the man inside still fits. The names I couldn't say out loud. Some names live on walls. carved in marble, stamped in metal, framed in dusty photographs above fireplaces that don't burn anymore. But others, they live in silence, not because they're forgotten, but because remembering them out loud feels like betrayal, as if by speaking their names, you might wake the part of yourself that still grieves too loudly. I carry names, not just in my memory, but in my breath, in my steps, in the pauses between my words. Some of them you already know, Wilkins, Stute or Hal, but there are others, names I never said at home, not because I couldn't, but because they never sounded right outside the trench, like whispers that belonged only to the mud and the frost and the fire. There was Jasper. He had hands too delicate for rifles. He carved animals from soap to pass. The tiny creatures that didn't belong in a place built for ruin. He was the first to die in my unit, shot before I even knew his last name. I found a small lion in his pocket, still intact. I didn't bury it. I still have it because someone had to carry something soft. There was August. He taught me how to tie a bandage with one hand. He knew 7 words in Latin and used all of them to name stars. We called him Professor, even though he'd never been to school. He died whispering, "Tell the night I waited." I never knew what he meant. Croom, but I still look up sometimes and answer. I know. There was Jonah, a cook, terrible at it, but generous. He gave me half his biscuit on a day I had nothing left but fear. He never wrote letters, said his family was made of wind. I don't even know if he was real, but I see his face whenever the oven makes that smell. Burnt flour and stubborn hope. And then there were the ones whose names never learned. The boy with the scar across his knuckles who shared his blanket with a dying dog. The tall man who hummed lullabies in languages no one understood. The private who wept every time it rained and said nothing about why. They didn't need names to matter. Their stories wrote themselves into the trench walls, into the boots they left behind, into the silence that stretched between gunfire like breath between sobs. People at home would say, "Tell us about your comrades," and I'd nod, smile politely, say they were brave. But how do you explain men who became your brothers? Not through blood, but through the way you both stared at the same dead crow and said nothing. How do you name someone when their name is tangled in the sounds you can't forget? I kept a list once, wrote down each name I could remember, folded it carefully, carried it in my breast pocket. One day, during a thunderstorm, the paper got wet. The ink bled into itself. The names blurred into one another, and I wept harder than I had in years, because I realized something. They were already fading, even inside me. So I stopped writing them down. I started saying them in my head before sleep, one by one, a silent roll call, not for them, for me, to remind myself who I had walked beside, who I had wept with, who I had buried in places even I couldn't return to. Some nights, I say their names into my pillow, not loud, not even fully formed, just the syllables that still hum. In my bones, Jazz, D-O, Gas, Joe, and when I reach the ones I forgot, I say nothing, because silence, too, can be sacred. If you're still listening tonight, before you close your eyes, whisper a name you haven't spoken in years. It doesn't have to belong to someone you lost in war, someone you don't want the world to forget, because names, when carried in love, never fully disappear. They echo, softly, faithfully, like a heartbeat beneath your own. Where we found warmth in a cold war, they say it was one of the coldest winters in history. I believe them, not just because the water froze in our cups, or because the ground cracked when we walked, but because we stopped feeling our fingers, long before we stopped needing them. It wasn't just the cold outside that hurt, it was the cold inside. the one that crept into your thoughts, your breath, your hope. But somehow, we still found warmth, not in fires. There was rarely wood, rarely permission, but in something else, something deeper, quieter, shared. There was a soldier named Peter. He hummed in his sleep. Not loud, just enough that on the coldest nights, it sounded like a memory crawling under your blanket. He didn't know he did it. We never told him, because the lullabies were keeping all of us alive. Someone once smuggled in a candle. One single wax stick, chipped and crooked. They lit it during a snowstorm. And we all gathered around like it was sacred. We didn't speak, just stared at the flame, watching the shadows dance across each other's faces. For a moment, we weren't soldiers. We were boys in a storybook cave, waiting for the monsters to pass. And somehow, quomped, the monsters listened. We found warmth in socks, passed down from home, even if they were already threadbare, in letters read aloud, even when they weren't ours, in hands held briefly, secretly, when words were too heavy to carry. One night, a package arrived. We didn't expect it. Inside was stale bread, a tin of peaches, and a note that simply said, "To whoever is cold tonight." We didn't know who sent it, didn't care. We cut the bread into 15 uneven pieces, passed the tin around like it was wine. It tasted of sugar and summer, of something that hadn't been destroyed yet. And for a while, it felt full, not in our stomachs, split in our chests. Even the animals tried to help. A stray dog wandered into the trench one morning, shivering, but determined. He slept against our feet, his small body warmer than any blanket. We named him Captain. He outranked all of us. When we lost someone, he would lie beside their boots. No barking, no whimpering, just presence. That was warmth, too. And sometimes we found warmth in stories, not the kind about heroes, but about home, about the way your sister used to braid her hair, about the way your father smelled after working the fields, about the time you fell in love, even if you never told her. We told those stories in whispers, not to entertain, but to remind ourselves that we had been more than this once. There was a moment, I remember it like a photograph. It was snowing sideways, visibility gone. Time paused, and one of the men, a Scotsman, stood up and began to sing. No one stopped him, no one laughed. He sang a song about hearth and honey and mothers, and one by one, we joined in. Men from countries who'd never spoken the same language, singing the same melody, in different keys, with different pain, but in perfect warmth. After that day, we kept singing. Not every night, just the coldest ones. It became our fire, kind of shared shelter. The warmth we built with sound lasted longer than any flame. Years later, someone asked me, "How did you survive the cold?" I didn't mention blankets, or coats, or fire. I said, we passed our breath to each other until we remembered how to feel human again. And maybe that's all warmth really is. Not heat, not flame, but presence. The kind that says, "I see you, I hear you, I'll stay," even when the world feels frozen. So if you ever find yourself in a winter of your own, a season of silence or sorrow or slow breaths, don't just look for fire. Look for people who whisper songs, for hands that reach gently, for stories told in darkness, for dogs who curl beside your boots. Because even in the coldest war, there's warmth if you're willing to share it. The day we stopped calling them enemies. It's strange, isn't it? It's how a man you've never met, a man wearing the wrong color, a man whose language you can't understand, can suddenly feel more like a neighbor than the silence in your own trench. We were taught to call them enemies, told they were monsters, threats, less than men. But the war, it has a way of stripping illusions, of showing you that hate wears a uniform just as loosely as love does. There was a moment, a winter afternoon, brittle and gray dot. We were low on food, low on energy, low on reasons to still follow orders across no man's land. The German trench stood like a mirror, not just in shape, but in sorrow. I remember seeing a man, young, tall, slouched, stand above the wall. He didn't raise a weapon. He raised a tin can and slowly tossed it. It landed near our trench inside. Chocolate. Clean. We didn't know what to do until one of our men, without a word, stood up and tossed a pair of socks. That's how it started. That night, we lit candles. So did they. Tiny flames flickering in the snow. It's visible from both sides. And then a voice from Tybe. Their side, singing, still not. We froze, every single one of us. Then one of our boys joined in. Same melody, different words. Silent night. 2 languages, 1 hymn sung into a sky that had seen too much blood. The next morning, we climbed out, all of us, hands visible. No rifles. We met in the middle, where the land was broken and still. Someone pulled out a harmonica. Someone else, a loaf of dry bread. There was laughter, real warm. I saw a German soldier hand one of ours, a photograph, a wife, a child, a small dog. We didn't speak the same tongue, but the eyes told us everything. He missed them. We missed ours. We weren't so different. We played a match. A football made of rags, boots for goalposts. Cheers in every accent. No one kept score, because that wasn't the point. The point was, for once, no one was dying. For once, the earth held footprints instead of bodies. Command didn't like it. Said we were fraternizing. Said it was dangerous. But what's more dangerous than forgetting that your enemy is just another version of yourself? After that day, something changed. We still fought. We still obeyed. But when a shell landed, we sometimes whispered a name. Not of a comrade, but of the man across the field who'd handed you half an orange the week before. And sometimes we aimed wide on purpose, because the war was not always between men. Sometimes it was between orders and mercy. I kept a button once from a German coat. The man who gave it to me said "Var GLCK, full luck." I don't know if he survived, but I carried that button all the way home, sewed it inside my coat. Not for luck, it's for remembrance. Years later, I saw a headline, "Peace declared, K." And I thought of him, the boy with the photograph, K, the man with the chocolate, the soldier who kicked the football with muddy joy, and because I knew peace didn't start with a treaty. It started with a song, a shared glance, a broken language that still managed to say, "I see you." If you ever find yourself pointing a finger or raising your voice or building a wall between you and them, pause. Ask yourself, who told you they were the enemy? And if they stood in front of you right now, bare hands, tired eyes, would you still believe? It's the bravest thing we can do is to stop calling people enemies and start calling them what they've been all along, human. What came home in silence? Some people brought back souvenirs, badges, medals, photographs, helmets, dented by time and memory, things to show, to prove, to tell stories with. I didn't bring much. A worn-out coat, a pair of boots no one asked about, a small lion carved from soap, which I kept hidden in a wooden box, and silence. That last one came without permission. It attached itself to my breath, to my skin, to my sleep. I didn't pack it. I didn't want it, but silence followed me home like a shadow, too tired to let go. The war ended. They said there were speeches, church bells, people clapping for names they barely remembered. Men returning to the towns that raised them, to families that waited with casseroles and cautious joy, and me. I stepped off the train and stood on the platform for 10 minutes before anyone realized I was there. Not because they didn't care, but because I didn't know how to step forward. I'd forgotten how to walk without watching the sky. My mother cried, but not loudly. She touched my face as if checking for fractures. Then she said something. I never expected. Do you still like apples? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't, but because I wasn't sure what I liked anymore. I slept in my old bed the first night. Everything looked smaller. The window, the dresser, even the sky outside felt like it had moved further away in the silence in that room. It was different from the one in the trenches. This silence wasn't full of fear or breath-holding tension. It was just empty, hollow, clean, too. It's clean. People tried to be kind. Neighbors brought bread. The pastor nodded solemnly at church. Children peeked at me from behind fences, as if waiting for a story or a scar. But I had nothing to give them, because the version of me they remembered, he didn't come back. And the one who did, he didn't know what to say without falling apart. I tried to speak once. At dinner, my uncle asked again, "So, how was it, really?" The table got quiet. Forks paused. I looked at the candle. In the center, its flame flickered. Its shadow danced across the wall. And I said, it was loud. That was all. No one asked again. I didn't want pity. I didn't want medals, polished or hung. I wanted someone to sit with me in silence and not ask me to fill it, because the things I carried, they didn't fit into answers. They were made of images that refused to fade, mud beneath fingernails that belonged to hands I held as they died. Boots facing east because west had nothing left. A voice whispering, "Tell her I held on." Even though no one knew who her was anymore, I spent mornings in the field behind our house, not working, just standing, listening to the wind, to birds, to the subtle crackle of dry grass beneath my feet. I needed to know the world still made small noises. Not explosions, not screams, just life. One morning I heard a child laugh, far off, sharp, bright, and I wept because I realized I had forgotten that sound existed. The silence came with me everywhere. In my sleep, it filled the cracks between dreams. In conversations, it hovered like a second voice, asking me to choose my words carefully or not at all. In church, I didn't pray. I listened, not for God, for the men who never made it home, with their voices in the wooden pews, in the cracks of the stained glass, in the way the dust moved in the light. I visited the town square once, a ceremony, flags, a speech from the mayor. They asked all returned men to stand. I did, and someone clapped. Then more. But the sound bounced off my skin like rain on metal, because I didn't feel like someone would return. I felt like someone still looking for the way back. At night, silence became heavier, not louder, just heavier, thicker, like a blanket soaked in memory. I tried writing. I filled pages, then tore them. I tried walking, but even the trees seemed to echo with footsteps I no longer trusted. One evening, I went down to the river. It was calm, still, indifferent. I sat on the bank and threw a stone, then another, and with each one, I whispered a name, not loudly, not fully, just enough for the wind to carry. Names I hadn't said in years. Names buried deeper than bullets, and for the first time in months, I felt something shift, not leave, just loosen, like the silence had been holding its breath, and now it was listening back. That's the thing about silence. It's not the enemy, it's the invitation. It asks us to listen to what we've buried, not so we drown in it, but so we can finally float. People thought I was distant. I wasn't. I was just walking through places they couldn't see, rooms filled with boots and letters, and the echoes of songs sung through frozen lips. They thought I was broken, but I wasn't. I was just full of the things that didn't burn, full of the stories, too soft to say, full of the silence between the shells, still ringing, still alive, still sacred. Eventually, I found work, a shop, quiet, steady, I kept to myself. Spoke when needed. Sometimes I saw other men like me. We didn't nod, didn't talk. We just knew, like two candles, noticing each other's flame across a long, dark room. Years later, someone asked me, "What did you bring back from the war?" And I said, "Silence." They looked confused, so I added, "The kind that lets you remember without speaking. It's the kind that listens even when you don't know what you're trying to say. The kind that sits beside you and never asks you to be someone else." If you've never come home with silence in your hands, you might not understand, and that's okay. But if you meet someone who hesitates before answering, who stares at the sky a little too long, tweaked objects without explanation, don't rush them, don't fix them, just sit beside them. Let the silence speak, because sometimes it says exactly what we need to hear. The days we didn't mark on calendars. Some days leave scars, some leave medals, some get carved into monuments or folded into history books, and some disappear, not because they didn't matter, but because they were too quiet to be recorded. We didn't mark them on calendars. There was no headline, no officer's report, no entry in a soldier's journal, just breath, mud, hands resting on the edge of the trench, eyes staring at skies that didn't choose sides. These were the days that taught me more about war than any explosion ever could. The truth is, not every day in a war is a battle. Sometimes the horror comes from waiting, and sometimes from not having anything to wait for. There were mornings we woke up and didn't know what we were supposed to do. No orders, no movement, just exist. And when survival isn't urgent, you begin to remember that you're human, which, oddly enough, is the hardest part. One such day, it rained. Not the violent kind, soft drizzle, almost respectful. The kind of rain that didn't soak you, reminded you the sky still had tears left. We stood there, boots deep in slush, helmets tilted back. No one spoke. Then one of the boys, Michael, a farmhand from the Midlands, started singing. Not a war song, a nursery rhyme. Mary had a little lamb, and we laughed. God help us, we laughed, because it was absurd, because it was real, because we remembered for one small moment what it was like to feel safe. That day didn't make the newspapers, but I remember it better than the day we overran the hill, better than the day I pulled a friend's body from the wire, because that day we weren't heroes, we weren't numbers, we weren't shadows in someone else's story. We were boys, just boys, soaking wet, laughing in the rain. There was another day when someone found a cat, a real one, stray, orange, thin, but alive. We didn't know where it came from. Maybe it had wandered in from some ghost village. We named her Lucky. She curled up in our rations, boxed and slept like she belonged there. No one touched her. No one disturbed her, because for a few hours, it had something small and soft to protect. Lucky stayed with us for 2 whole days. Then she vanished, just like she came. No footprints, no sound, and we never spoke of her again. But we all looked for her when the nights got long. There was a boy named Eli. He was quiet, carried a piece of charcoal in his pocket. He didn't talk much, but he drew on the trench walls, on scraps of wood, on his hands. Sometimes, once I asked him why, he said, "Because if I can't leave a grave, I'll leave a shape." I didn't understand then. I do now. He was trying to leave proof that he'd been, that he'd seen, that he hadn't disappeared, just because no one would. Remember the date. Some of the most painful moments of war don't come with sound. They come with routine, with watching someone stare too long at nothing, with seeing a letter returned unopened, with hearing someone breathe too evenly after a nightmare, because they've learned not to scream anymore. These aren't moments history books know what to do with, but they mattered. They mattered because they were what war is really made of. Not bullets, but boredom. Not explosions, but erosion. Not death, but forgetting how to live. One afternoon, there was sunlight, real sunlight, warm on the face, a rarity. I took off my helmet and tilted my head back. So did the others. We didn't say a word. We just stood there, faces turned to the light, like flowers that had waited too long to bloom. Someone cried, not from sadness, from memory. The sun reminded us of gardens, porches, of laundry on lines, dancing in the breeze, of things that didn't belong to this place, but still reached for us anyway. That night, someone found an old pack of cards. We played until the candle died. No one kept score. No one cared. It wasn't about winning. It was about passing time without being afraid of it. They never told us about these days. When we enlisted, they told us about glory, about duty, about sacrifice. But they didn't tell us about the waiting, the quiet, the long hours where you sit and stare at your own hands and wonder if you'll ever be proud of them again. They didn't tell us that war has fillers, and that those might hurt worse than the headline moments, because there, when you begin to see yourself fading. I once wrote a letter on one of those empty days, just to write. I didn't send it. There was no address, no name, just a single sentence. If today mattered to no one, let me be the one who remembers it. I buried it in the dirt near the latrine. Not the most noble spot, maybe the most honest dot, because even the forgotten places deserve to remember something. Now, when I walk through life, older, slower, I think of those days, the in-betweens, the space between shellings, the hour between dawn and orders, the gap between questions and the courage to answer. And I wonder, how many of us still live there? People want to remember the loud parts, the brave parts, but I remembered the hands cleaning rifles slowly, the way someone tied their bootlaces twice, not out of fear, but habit. The moment someone tore their last photograph and shared half with the man beside them, just so no one would be without a face. Those things, they happened on days we didn't mark, days that disappeared like footprints in snow, but they built us quietly, fully. If you're hearing this, if your life feels like it's paused, if you feel like today is unremarkable, unworthy of memory, you're wrong. Some of the most important days will never make it into photos or posts or poems, but they shape you anyway. So tonight, if nothing happens, if no one calls, if no fire is lit, no decision is made, breathe, look up, let the silence hold you like a small orange cat curled inside your chest, because not all days are made for history. Some are made for healing, even if no one writes them down. The things we didn't say before they left. Some things were never said, not because we didn't want to say them, but because we didn't know how. Not then, and by the time we found the words, there was no one left to hear them. There are still conversations folded in my chest like unfinished letters, each sentence trailing off at the edge of memory. The war was full of those half-formed goodbyes, cut-off confessions, eyes that almost said it all, but blinked before they could. I think of Wilkins. The last thing he said to me was, "You all right?" I said, "Yeah." He nodded. Then he stood, slung his pack over his shoulder, and stepped up onto the fire step. I never saw him again. I wish I'd said, "No, I'm not all right." But I'm glad you asked. Well, what Judd said, "Wait, let's talk." Even for a minute. I wish I'd said anything that mattered, but instead, let him walk away, believing we had more time. There's something cruel about war, not just the death, the distance between people still alive. You sleep next to a man for weeks, share food, water, fire, but you never ask about his daughter's name. You never ask if he believed in ghosts, right? What his favorite book was, or why he always ties his left boot tighter than his right, because you don't want to know. what you'll miss. You don't want to carry more weight when they leave, so you say less and less till silence becomes the safest language. But that silence doesn't stay quiet forever. It echoes years later in rooms that no longer smell like mud or smoke. In moments when someone says something ordinary, okay? And suddenly your chest fills with words you never said to someone who's gone through door. Once showed me a picture, 2 boys, arms around each other, smiling. He said, "Those are mine." I asked, "What are their names?" He opened his mouth, paused, then laughed. "I've said them so many times, I'm scared to say them now." What if they sound different in your ears? I didn't understand then, but now I do. Some names are too sacred to hand over. Some memories live better in whispers. There was a boy named Jacob. He had a stammer, but he wrote beautifully. He used to scribble poetry on anything he could find: matchboxes, old envelopes, the inside of his uniform collar. One day, he handed me a scrap of paper, just one line: "Don't wait for peace to learn how to speak." Still have that, folded and worn. He never made it past October. I don't know who else he gave his words to, but I like to believe they reached someone, even if they weren't read, even if they were just held. We used to have a ritual. Every time one of us was assigned to a dangerous patrol, the others would nod, just a nod, no speeches, no prayers, because if we said too much, it would make the risk too real. But the nod meant everything. It meant, "I see you. I'd follow you if I could. Come back, or I'll carry this for the rest of my life." We all understood the language of the unsaid. When someone died, there were no eulogies. We packed their things in silence. We buried them in whatever space we had. We looked at the ground instead of each other, and afterward, we returned to our rifles, our rations, our trench wall routine. But inside, we all had sentences that never made it past our lips. I should have asked if you were afraid. I should have told you that story you wanted to hear. I should have held your hand when the light went out. It wasn't just the dead we didn't speak to. It was the living, too. There were things we couldn't tell the people back home, not because they wouldn't listen, but because we didn't know how to make them understand. How do you explain watching a man comb his hair before going over the top, just in case they found his body? How do you explain saving a rat's life because you couldn't bear to watch anything else die? How do you say, "Today, the world stopped and I didn't notice until the sun came up again"? So we sent letters with safe words, polite words, doing fine. Hope the weather's kind there. Was thinking of apple pie. But what we meant was, today, I saw a boy smile as he died. Today, I forgot my own name for a moment. Today, I remembered the sound of your voice, and it almost broke me. I once wrote a letter to my brother. I tore it up before sealing it, because it was too honest, because it said, "If I come back, I won't be the one who left. Will you still want me?" I never sent another one. When I finally did come home, the hardest part wasn't the noise. It was the silence. The way people waited for me to say something, anything. And all I could think of was everything I didn't to say to the ones who never got to return. All the names I never spoke aloud. All the thanks I never gave. All the small, sacred things I let pass without a voice. One night, years later, I stood in front of a mirror and said every name I could remember, even the ones I'd whispered only in dreams. I said, "I'm sorry. I remember you. I wish I'd told you what your laugh did to the dark." And then I cried. Not because I was grieving, but because, finally, I wasn't silent. If you're hearing this now and there's something you've heard, kept in your chest too long, say it, even if no one's around. Even if the words come out cracked, say it, because silence may keep us safe, but truth makes us free. And the ones we lost, they deserve to be remembered, not just in stone, but in sound. Tell them you loved them. Tell them they were brave. Tell Them, they made you laugh. Tell them you were scared too. Tell them you're still here and they're still with you. The things that didn't rot in the trench. Most things in the trenches rotted. Cloth, food, skin, hope, moisture touched everything. It crept, seeped, clung, turned boots to paper, uniforms to pulp, hands to clay. The smell, if you've never lived, it wasn't just of decay. It was of waiting, of things once alive trying to hold on longer than they were meant to, of stories softening in the damp before they were done being told. But not everything succumbed. Some things didn't rot, couldn't, wouldn't, and those were the things we clung to. Not because they were strong, but because they reminded us we still were. There was a wooden comb, carved by hand. Not beautiful, not polished, just practical. It belonged to Eli. He used it every morning, rain or frost. Not for vanity, but ritual. He'd say, "If my hair is still here, then so am I." I found that comb 3 weeks after he was gone. It's tucked inside his rucksack, wrapped in cloth. Still dry, still carrying the shape of his hand. I keep it to this day, because that comb never learned how to rot. Someone once left a flower on the trench wall. A real one, bright yellow, pressed between layers of cloth. We never found out who placed it there. It lasted a full week, longer than it should have, unnaturally. Long. Every man who passed, it looked, but didn't speak. It became a kind of shrine, not to faith, not to country. In every word you never got to say. Someone once left a flower on the trench wall, a real one, bright yellow, pressed between layers of cloth. We never found out who placed it there. It lasted a full week, longer than it should have, naturally long. Every man who passed, it looked, but didn't speak. It became a kind of shrine, not to faith, not to country, but to beauty, to the audacity of something delicate refusing to die in a place built for death, even after its petals fell. The memory of its color lingered in that didn't rot. I once saw a man write a song on the back of a ration wrapper. The paper was already torn. The ink was watered down. His hands trembled, but he hummed as he scribbled. The melody drifted through the trench like smoke, light, untouchable, alive. He died 2 nights later, but the others kept humming his tune, even when the words faded, even when the wrapper dissolved in mud. The melody outlived its maker. Because music doesn't rot. There was a photograph, a woman holding a baby. The corners were curled, the surface blurred, but the eyes remained sharp. The soldier who carried it tucked it in wax paper, then inside his shirt, then in a second pocket, stitched by hand. I found it after a gas attack. It was the only thing dry on his body. I couldn't throw it away, not because I knew her, but because someone had once called her everything. And when something means everything, it doesn't rot. It becomes part of the air of the living, of the ones who look at it next. One winter night, a boy found a book of poetry. French poems, soft and romantic. He couldn't read them. He carried it anyway, kept it beneath his blanket. Read it aloud in broken syllables, just to hear a rhythm again. One night, I asked why. He said, if the words can survive this, maybe I can too. It wasn't just objects, it was gestures, the way someone shared their last spoon of jam without speaking, the way someone drew smiley faces on their mess tin with chalk, the way someone hummed themselves just loud enough for the rest of us to remember what peace might feel like. Small things, unwritten things, the things history forgets, but they didn't rot because they weren't made of flesh. They were made of choice. I carried a small line carved from soap. Wilkins made it, gave it to me after our first month in. It's nothing, he said, but maybe one day you'll need a lion more than you need a gun. It softened over time, lost shape, may never disappeared. Even after the war, I kept it in a box, wrapped in cloth. When everything else around me decayed, that lion endured. Because courage, even when carved from soap, doesn't rot. Sometimes I wonder why certain things survive. Why the comb, the flower, the tune, the photo, the poem, the soap lion. Why those? Why not the uniforms, the journals, the names on bark crosses now faded beyond reading? Maybe because we tried too hard to preserve the big things and the small ones. They survived because they were carried, not forced, held gently, remembered quietly, loved fully. After the war, I unpacked slowly. Most of what I brought back went straight into the attic, but the unratted things, they stayed close. The comb in my drawer, the photograph inside my old book, the soap lion in the palm of my hand. Whenever I was afraid to sleep, sometimes I dream of the trench again. Not during battle, during stillness. I see the flower on the wall, the boy humming the melody, the comb resting beside a mirror of tin. And in those dreams, the mud never touches them. Time doesn't reach them. They float, glow, breathe, because the soul of a place isn't built from bricks. It's built from what refused to rot. If you're hearing this now and you're surrounded by decay, by endings, by things that used to be beautiful, look closer. There's always something that stayed whole. Even if it's just a note, a name, a sound, a shape. Even if it's just a memory of a yellow flower growing for 7 days. Against all logic, not everything in war dies, and not everything after war lives. But the things we carry, it's the ones we chose to keep, the ones that time couldn't turn to dust. Those are the pieces that keep us human. They tell us what to fight for when the fighting is done, and they tell us gently, you're still here, and so are we, where the rain still touched me. Rain has a memory. It doesn't just fall. It returns, not to the sky, but to something inside you. Long after the war was over, long after the uniforms were folded and the flags had faded, the rain still touched me in places I didn't know were open. Not my skin, my silence. It reached there, gently, without asking, and I let it into trenches. Rain was the enemy. It turned earth to soup, boots to anchors, sleep into shivering. It crept into every layer of you, even your hope. I once saw a man cry, not because someone died, but because he woke up wet for the 9th day in a row. Rain broke us in ways bloods couldn't, but after the war, after everything, the rain changed. The first time it rained after I returned, I froze. I was walking down a dirt road toward a small cafe. The sky cracked open like a quiet apology, and before I could take cover, I stood still. Every drop was a memory. The weight of a soaked letter in my pocket. The way the door used to hum to the rhythm of falling water. The scent of rust, damp wool, and breathless waiting. But this rain was different. Warmer, slower, not trying to drown anything, just trying to reach it. So I stood there. I let it. People passed me with umbrellas, with questions. I just smiled and stayed. That became my ritual. When it rained, I walked not far. It's just enough to be wet, to remember, to heal. Some wounds don't respond to bandages, only to weather. It's repetition. 2 falling skies. I walked through fields, through alleyways, through cemeteries that didn't know they were still sacred. Each raindrop, a small sermon. Each step, a release. I didn't carry weapons anymore, but I still carried names and the rain. Somehow knew how to say them better than I could. There was a particular street lamp at the edge of town. Under it, the light would catch every droplet like gold. I'd stand there after closing the shop, coat unbuttoned, eyes closed, and I'd whisper, say it for me, not to anyone, to the rain, and it would. You see, the rain speaks in echoes, not of sound, of feeling. It doesn't shout. It remembers. And in those moments, I remembered too. The boy who danced barefoot in the mud one night because it made him feel alive. The man who wiped his tears and said, "It's just the rain." And we believed him. The silence that came after a storm when all we could hear was breath, okay, and dripping helmets. And the softest, deepest kind of being, rain taught me to feel again, because it doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand strength, doesn't look for medals. It just falls. And in doing so, it invites you to fall too, not in weakness, but in return to softness, to openness, to whatever was covered too long. I once met a woman in the rain. She was standing under a tree, watching birds scatter. She saw me walk past, drenched, smiling. She said, "You're not from here." I replied, "I'm not from anywhere anymore." She paused, then said, "You walk like you've earned the storm." And maybe I had. We spoke often after that. Not about the war. She never asked. She didn't need to. She listened like rain does, without interruption. I told her about the silence, about the soap lion, about the melody that still played when I held my breath just right. She told me about her garden, about the way roots respond to thunder, about how some flowers only bloom after being broken by wind. We understood each other, even when we didn't speak. One day, it rained harder than usual. It's a kind of storm that turns the air silver. She walked beside me, neither of us with coats. She reached for my hand and said, "Does it still hurt, okay?" And I said, "Only when I forget to let it." She nodded. We stood under that street lamp, the one that turned water into fire, and I cried. Not from pain, not from guilt, from softness, from the miracle that something could still move inside me. You see, the war didn't take everything, but it tried to take wonder, tried to take the sound of small things, tried to take the feeling of being touched by something that didn't want to harm you. Rain gave it back, not all at once, but drop by drop. It washed what couldn't be burned. It whispered over the wounds that wouldn't close. It's taught me to listen again, and sometimes to speak. People avoid the rain. I walk into it because there I am closest to the men I lost, closest to the part of me that still believes that something so gentle can be that strong, closest to the version of myself that still wants to be whole. There's a bench by the river now. I sit there when it rains. I don't think about the past. I listen for it, in the ripples, in the wind, in the space between drops. Sometimes I hear laughter, sometimes a name, sometimes nothing at all. And that is enough. If you've never let yourself stand in the rain, truly stand, not rush, not hide, not curse, but stand, try it. Let it touch you. Let it teach you, because water remembers where we cracked, and it chooses to fall there again, not to deepen the wound, but to baptize it, to make it something else. If you carry sorrow, if you carry silence, if the world asks you to move on, before you're ready to go for a walk, let the sky do the weeping. Let it fall into your palms, like everything you wish you'd said, but never could. The rain isn't here to punish, it's here to stay, with you as long as you need. The silence I chose to keep. Not all silence is forced. Some silence is chosen, not out of fear, not out of pain, but out of reverence. After the war, I used to think the silence that followed me was a wound, something that needed healing, or breaking, or escaping. But over time, I came to understand that some silences weren't left behind by war. They were gifts. They were the final shape of stories, too large for language. They were the way I carried the ones who never got to speak. Again, they were the voice of what I had no right to explain, only to guard. There are things I've never told anyone, not because they're too terrible, but because they're too sacred. A man's last glance before he let go. The way a song drifted across no man's land one morning, unclaimed by any mouth. The sound of boots that stopped mid-step and never resumed. These are not facts. They are relics. They belong to silence. And I chose to keep them there. People have asked me, what was the worst part? I've given many answers. The waiting, the cold, the noise, the smell. But the truth, the worst part was realizing that not everything deserved to be spoken. Some things must only be remembered, quietly, fully, without offering them to the world to be misunderstood. I've kept rooms inside me, rooms no one enters, not even the closest ones, not even those who tried. They're not locked because of shame. They're locked because they are whole as they are. Opening them wouldn't bring understanding. It would let in air that doesn't belong there. Those rooms are lined with silence, and within them, live moments to exact, to translate. Moments that shaped me without leaving scars. Moments that belonged to more than just me. To disturb them now would be to fracture something sacred. There was a day near the end. I don't speak of it often. We had taken a village. The enemy was gone. The air was still, and in a broken chapel, I found a man kneeling, not praying, kneeling. He looked at me. He said nothing, not because we were strangers, but because whatever passed between us was beyond language. I remember the dust in the light, the way the pews were cracked but upright, the smell of wax and stone. We stayed there, just breathing, knowing he died the next day. And I never told anyone about that chapel until now. Not because I was hiding it, because I was keeping it safe. There is a kind of silence that watches. It doesn't close in. It opens up. It lets you see what words can't carry. It lets you feel without interruption. That's the silence I chose to live with. I never wrote a book, never stood on stages, never answered journalists, not because I didn't remember, but because remembering is not the same as retelling. Memory isn't performance. It's prayer. It's something you return to, not to prove, but to feel. I went back to those fields once, not the battlefield, but nearby. The grass had grown. The mud was gone. Children ran with paper kites. I stood there, alone, and whispered the names I could still hold. No one heard me, except the wind. And maybe that's all I ever wanted. If you ask me what I've done with my life, I'll tell you. I kept silence like a flame, like a folded flag. Not because I had nothing to say, but because saying everything would have taken away its shape. There are songs that lose power when played too loud, paintings that blur when touched, and memories that live best unspoken. I've learned to honor them that way, not with noise, but with presence, with attention, with the kind of listening that doesn't need to answer back. Sometimes, when it rains, I open the window, not to get wet, but to let the silence breathe. It has waited long, it's held much, asked for nothing, so I sit beside it, and we don't talk. We remember, together, too. Those who returned and never spoke, I understand you. To those who never returned and left us holding silence in their place, I carry you to those who listen, not to respond, but to receive. You are rare. You are the reason silence still has a home. And to you, who stayed with me through these stories, who walked beside me, breath by breath, part by part, thank you. You didn't interrupt. You didn't rush. Didn't look away. That, in itself, is the highest form of remembering. So now I'll end this the way I've lived most days after the war, without fanfare, without final words, without trying to wrap it all in a sentence. Just silence, the kind that knows, the kind that stays, the kind that, in its stillness, says everything I never could. If you've made it to the end of this journey, thank you. You didn't rush past the quiet moments. You didn't look away from the hard ones. And maybe, just maybe, something in this silence spoke to a silence inside you too. Now I invite you to carry one thing forward. What memory would you keep in silence? Not because you can't speak it, but because you want to honor it. Share your answer in the comments if you wish, or simply hold it close, because some things don't need to be loud to last forever.